Hello and welcome to another video by FF underscore Spaceman Dave Wright. I just did this video for a freaking hour. And then I decided that I wouldn't watch myself talk for an hour to a freaking screen. So why should you guys? I'm gonna try to do this a little quicker, be a little bit more efficient. It is now 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, but it doesn't matter. I'm on freaking vacation, baby. And that's what it's all about. So today's video is a little bit different than normal for me. I am going to be doing more of a strategy, more of a zoom out, and just kind of tell you guys what's been kind of going on for the Spaceman. Because honestly, I have not been putting out as much patron content as I would like. Start off real strong. The last couple weeks kind of waned a little bit. And the reason is because I have what I'm trying to do right now is I am trying to zoom out and take a look at my fantasy process overall. And my biggest hole, I think, well, I wouldn't say my biggest hole. Like I have tons of holes in my fantasy game, but I need to learn more. I don't have all the answers when it comes to, to statistics. I don't have the best process. There are so many people out there who are better at it than I am. I think I'm adequate, but my confidence level isn't where it needs to be. And if I improve in that process, I will become better at data analysis, at explaining things to people who take the time to listen to me. So today, my goal is to tell you guys kind of what I have been learning and what I've been reflecting on the last couple of weeks, because that's what I've done the last 2 or 3 weeks. And I think that's kind of something that's valuable to share because, when I'm in the grind of just putting data together for a spreadsheet or preparing for a podcast, I just don't do as much critical thinking or as much, well, I do as much reflection and big picture improving overall as I would like to do because I'm a pretty competitive person. I think we're all very competitive people. But personally, I don't think I'm at where I want to be at. I want to become better. If I'm not learning, I'm stagnant. I'm not being the best I can be. So, and I have so much respect for all of these numbers freaking nerds out there, even these film people. I have a ton of respect for them as well. But God, it is intimidating what some of these people out like what the data. Some people, I have data envy, uh, and what some people are doing with their statistical analysis. It's intimidating. I don't want to put something out there and make a mistake and look like a freaking idiot, even though that's what I do constantly anyway. It's and I think there is value to making mistakes. Eventually, you make fewer and fewer, but I don't like feeling stupid. Like I don't want to put a ton of effort into something and look like a total dumbass all the time. I want to actually get a few things right. So I want to shore up my knowledge on statistics, and I think that I have as I've been reading. I read a bunch of articles, understood some of them, read a book that was pretty an easy book to read, Naked Statistics by George Whelan or John Whelan or something. And the idea is that it's basically statistics for the non-statistician or the non-expert, but it's still pretty substantive talk on statistics. And I've liked it. I've a lot of very good summaries and to the point of and why should we be learning these things that are complicated. And I never liked learning them when I learned them 10 different times in math class. So definitely recommend that book so far. But I think there is some value to talk about that tonight. And before I ramble on for another 30 minutes on philosophical things and telling you guys things that I can't believe I spent that much time talking to myself about, let's get into what I've learned and what I've reflected on. And big picture, I thought, what is my goal as a fantasy content creator? What is my purpose for doing this? Or what am I trying to achieve? And what I'm trying to achieve is I am trying to be as predictive as possible and accurate as possible and precise as possible when predicting future NFL production. I also want to be as efficient and skilled and whatever the word I'm looking for at communicating these ideas to people. I I want to make something that is complicated or is a big picture or a big something big to chunk off on. I want to communicate that in the simplest way and the most consumable way for people to understand. That's my goal. I want to give people information. I want to provide free data, obviously, for people so they can learn things themselves. But I also want to communicate things so people can learn and get better at fantasy football and do it in a fun, engaging way. And part of that is so going back to, some of it's going back to the beginning, going back to, and I know I've talked about this countless times with people, but I've gleaned something new when I was reading the book and reading 2 or 3 articles on this particular topic about descriptive versus predictive. Don't I like you? I can hear, I know I've said it 1,000 times to people, but I learned something a little bit new this time around. So, little refresher, descriptive stats, what they do, they exist to simplify things. And when you simplify something, there's a natural, inherent, implied, something is acknowledged that you're going to lose some nuance when you simplify something. You can't make something simpler and still explain everything there is about something. So QB rating, for example, we all agree that passing touchdowns are important, passing yards is pretty important, completion or accuracy is pretty important, not turning the ball over is pretty important, and those are all put in together into a stat that's supposed to describe QB performance. That's QB rating. Now, it's not the best stat. I think we all know that it's flawed and is it even useful and blah blah blah, but it definitely is simple. And there's a reason why people use it, because it's simple and it uses things that we all can kind of agree on that matter: accuracy, arm strength, throwing the ball down the field, scoring touchdowns, not turning the ball. We all can agree that those matter. They just weight them differently, and that's their metric that they create. In the past, I have been incredibly snobby and dismissive of descriptive statistics. And the reason is uh, because, sorry, I'm trying to think about the best way to put this. When people rely too heavily on a descriptive metric or stat, it can lead to misleading conclusions or having the undesired behavior. So again, over-reliance on a descriptive metric can lead to the wrong conclusions and actually the opposite of what you want them to do. And just same thing with, versus predictive is predicting what's going to happen next. Descriptive is just describing what's already happened. And why am I bringing this up again? Because I feel like I've talked about this pretty exhaustively, but the reason I was thinking about this and then it kind of had an aha moment is like simplicity. That is what makes descriptive stats. That's why people use them. They're simple. Yards per carry, incredibly simple stat. Excuse me. Yards per carry is very simple, and it kind of tells you, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's supposed to describe how efficient they are at gaining yards per carry. A very simple metric. You understand why people like it. I had this actually discussion with Shane and Finero a couple times on Rookie Fever, and I am pretty dismissive of yards per carry because I'm not acknowledging how simple it is and how how valuable that is to people. The simplicity of and understanding. So I need to acknowledge that when I'm talking to somebody instead of just like just poo-pooing it. And this is what I'm trying to understand is that when you are trying to communicate with people complicated things or change their way of thinking, which is incredibly difficult, instead of just confirming their biases, is that you need to understand why they like something. Why does and so once I acknowledge that they like it because it makes sense and it's simple. So what I need to say is like, hey, I hear what you're saying about yards per carry, but I actually got a simple freaking stat. I got two simple stats over here that do exactly are wicked simple. And also I have readily available in my free public database. And then they're also more predictive of future success. Evaded tackles per game and yards per attempt or scrim yards per team play, whatever you want to call it. Those are two incredibly simple statistics. One talks about a very simple thing, simple that, hey, how many tacklers you avoid is of course that makes sense. Why wouldn't that be a predict or indicative of a running back skill? Or yards per attempt it's as simple as instead of just dividing yards per carry, you're dividing it by yards per team attempt, like or running plays and passing plays. Your scrim yards divided by yards or total yards for the whatever, blah, blah, blah. But very simple. And if you use those instead, you're going to be not only understand what's happening just as easily and actually probably better because yards per carry actually is explaining something totally different than what you think it is. But these are doing what you want, and that's going to be better for your understanding of what's going to happen in the future. So I think that's something that's valuable that I've kind of learned. Also, I've talked about it a little bit, but making sure what you're measuring is what you want to be measuring. And the elements are the numbers you're measuring, make sure they're like terms. You have different types of values like and statistics, it's like absolute and relative values. Absolute is like a hard and fast number, like a touchdown. 10 touchdowns is an absolute number. But TD rate or TD percentage is a relative number. It's it's a percentage. That's the difference between absolute and relative. You do not want to compare TDs to TD rate. That is an ineffective way it's bad process when it comes to statistics. I want to compare like things, and I want to understand the unit of measurement that you're using. And then also understand and communicate just essentially that's kind of I think big because I think I've seen a lot of false equivalencies, false, people using things that aren't measuring what they think they're measuring. And I've done the same in the past too. So it's not like I'm far from perfect. So I'm just as guilty as the next person. But I think it's important to understand these basic principles of statistics, because if you don't, you're going to make mistakes. And then the next topic is mean versus median. Very simple thing. We've learned this thing probably 5 different years. You learn this thing in growing up. You probably learn it like 3 straight grades in middle school, learn it in 2 different classes in high school. Mean is the average. Median is the middle number, and mode, which is how many the number that occurs the most or whatever. A lot in fantasy football, we use mean or the average, and it's a pretty effective tool, except it's good for symmetrical data or data that forms a nice little curve, even curve, and is nice and even. That's the one you want to use the mean. So I can't really think of anything off the top of my head. I guess BMI could be decent because you look at how BMI is distributed, it's pretty even curve. Not that's a good way to talk about BMI, but overall, what's good about the mean is that you can do standard deviation. And I know people have probably heard that term thrown around. It's more complicated. It sounds more complicated than it is, but basically standard deviation is how far is the majority of the data from the average data point. And the more percentage of your data set that falls closer to the mean, the better your findings are, the better your sample is, and so that's what standard deviation is. And that's something that I'm going to be incorporating, not necessarily, I'm going to talk about standard deviation, no, but when I'm evaluating a stat or a metric, I'm going to be doing a lot more testing and understanding what different regression models are telling me and different statistical tools, because don't want to assume that just because I have a good R squared or I have a pretty graph or something that logically makes sense, I want to make sure that it statistically is valid as well. So, but standard deviation is very simple. But the problem is, why I bring this up in general is a lot of times in fantasy football, we're doing a disservice when we use the mean, the average. One, because it's a bias that you have when you use the average. Technically, there is no average wide receiver two. That player doesn't exist. It's a combination. You're not using an actual input. So when you're trying to predict what the average is going to be, you're using average to predict future years or all kinds of different reasons why you'd be using the average for. You're actually not using something that's real. So there's bias involved in that. There's mistakes that happen because of that you're actually using a wrong player. But also, too, and more specifically for statistics, what happens is when you have data that is skewed or not symmetrical, and you use the average to talk about a group of stats or players, you're not actually talking about what you really want to. You're not measuring the the most common or the shared center of the data point that you want to be talking about. So what median does is it accounts for that. When you have, so for example, Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, really skewed wide receiver one scoring, running back one scoring this year. So top 12 running backs have a pretty high, points per game, because Alvin Kamara, Dalvin Cook really skewed that this year. And it raised what you would think that. So when you have someone like an RB11 and you say, oh, look, the average RB12 or the top 12 RB scored this, and they're a top 12 RB, so that's a good player, and blah, blah, blah. You're making, you realize that the top players are actually skewing that. So when you look at like, hey, how do RB12 score over years? And then you're saying, hey, look at how these average RBs or top 12 RBs are scoring. And if I land, if look at all these seasons that they're top 12 RBs for, you might be missing out on what actually is the winning part of an RB1, top 12 RB. And that's those top 3, top 4 running backs. That, yeah, it's great to have any RB, like top 12 RB, but those top scoring RBs are the league winners. And Alvin Kamara is skewing that data. So when you mess that up, and when you're using the average instead of the middle number, you're really misconstruing what you're trying to figure out. And you can look this up. I'm doing just a quick overview of it, but something that I'm really going to be taking into practice a lot too is understanding the flaws of using averages. And then statistical indexes, kind of similar to just simplifying data in general, but you need to ask ourselves when we're using BMI, QBR, CPOE, Spark scores. I guess even breakout age technically could be considered a index. That is a summary that those so I guess I should back up a little bit. Statistical indexes takes a group of numbers and boils them down and weights them a certain way to point out a single output. So BMI takes height and weight and spits out a single number to describe their body mass index. QBR takes a bunch of different things that I don't know that goes into QBR. I would calculate it myself. to talk about a single metric for QB. CPOE talks about does this strength of opponent, the depth of the target, and then spits out a number for their completion percentage over or under. Spark score is an adjustment is a single metric talking about the athleticism of a player. Are these indexes helpful or harmful to what they're trying to construe? Or do they even construe what you think they are? Are they measuring what you think they are? For some of them, I think QBR is pretty freaking good. CPOE is pretty freaking good. People might argue that EPA per attempt for QBs is better than CPOE. I have not. That's pinned for something to do later. But BMI, I think, is bad. I think it does more harm than good, especially with how much people rely on it. Even for running backs too. I just did a thing for Todd the other day, and I think that BMI is overrated for running backs as well. Spark score is definitely overrated, and when people start talking about, oh, he has an 80th percentile Spark score, that is a mistake when you start using that in your analysis. So I think that's harmful. So just ask yourself, when you were trying to come up with something, maybe in your model spits out a final number or a stat that you rely on, ask yourself, is that stat, when I use that one stat or that one index to simplify something, is it worth it? Is that simplification telling me what I want to do? Is it helping or is it hurting? And then probability, quickly go through it, because I struggle with probability. Honestly, right when I think I learned something, I end up not ever using it again and I forget about it. But so basically statistics is when you take data and probability and you make inferences from it when you combine them. So probability is when it's studying like the outcomes of when something has uncertainty involved. That's probability. A couple of different ways to kind of describe types of probability is like finite versus infinite outcomes, I think, is how I kind of understand it. Flipping a coin is finite. There's only two options when you flip a coin. 1 in 2 odds of flipping heads, 1 in 4 odds of flipping heads twice in a row. But infinite outcomes kind of are like a wide receiver in the NFL. They could have an injury-ridden career. They could become a successful wide receiver. They could become a backup, or they could have a drug problem. They could have alcohol problems. They could have injuries. They could have performance-enhancing drugs issues. They could have a attitude problem. They could have problems with the law. They could have health problems. They could get in a car accident. There are so many different outcomes that could happen on the field that we need to understand that that's the type of probability we're not doing. Like, it's not the same as flipping a coin. That probability is not the same as what we're expecting to happen in the future for wide receivers or running backs in the NFL, as for rookie prospects based on their previous product, like comparing them to previous classes. Sometimes you have to understand that the NFL is changing. Are we lagging behind as what we're trying to predict and the tools we're using? Are we trying to predict something that was happening maybe if this was 5 years ago, we'd be getting it right, but there's a new NFL now. There's new rules. There's new rules. There's more passing happening. Like running backs had a spike in 2019, but I think they fell again in 2020. So just understanding how the NFL is working too, is that something we should be taking into consideration when we're talking about hit rates and miss rates and stuff. Probability, some of the biggest mistakes with talking about probability and hit rates, miss rates, is not properly understanding risk. And that's something I'm going to get into a separate episode, but I actually think I'm going to do some actual writing on risk and understanding what the risk of your first round pick is, a risk of taking a first round running back, risk of taking a first round quarterback, risk of doing a first round draft pick, top 3 pick in rookie drafts, and talk about what that risk is and how do we properly weigh risk in fantasy football. I think that's actually, I think, intriguing, and something I'm excited to write about. But other common errors are, I don't want to get into errors of probability. I'm getting close to the end of the night here. But essentially, I think it's important to think about this stuff and understand and try to make our process better. So a lot of people I think who are following or who are on the Patreon or listening to me on Twitter or whatever you want us to call it, they might be more data inclined, or they value that, but they just don't want to do it themselves. So I think it's just important to understand biases that happen in when we're working with data, the importance of doing the proper procedures, like what happens, like there's so many things that can go wrong when you're modeling. I think it's important to understand the proper way to model. It's important to understand the proper way to compare different numbers, different stats. It's important to understand, what are we trying to do when we're giving analysis? Are we trying to be the smartest guy in the room? Or are we trying to make our people who are listening to us learn something? Are we trying to make them better fantasy players? In the past, I've tried to be the smartest person in the room. Well, maybe I've just tried not to be the dumbest person in the room, but I just want to, I think, I just want to give a little peek behind the curtain, what I've been doing the last couple of weeks. I have not been neglecting you guys, trying to make my process better, guys and girls, I should say, and just so I can give the best possible product coming up. So look for more rookie profiles from Rookie Fever. More episodes from Rookie Fever too this week. I think we're gonna have like 4 episodes this week for Rookie Fever. Another episode of Tales of Rivals will be coming out this weekend, probably, maybe Thursday, Friday. Recording with Peter Howard this week. Recorded with Zach Reed last week, and recording with the TFN pod crew tomorrow night or Wednesday night, and a lot of fun things looking forward to. And I'm going to try to get an article out this week too for DLF. And I have a feeling like I'm going to do some more BMI trashing too. And I want to try to get my ranks up. I want to get ranks up for you guys this week too. I was on vacation. But if there's also anything else that you'd like me to do or talk about, a lot of you guys have all been great about reaching out when you have a question, but please feel free to reach out to me, message me on Patreon, message me on Twitter. And thanks for hopping on. I hope you guys found this useful. This was something new for me. But yeah, so I hope you guys, I think it's important to talk about process and talk big picture and what we're trying to do and get better at it, because or else what the heck are we trying to do here? But anyway, thanks for listening and watching. Feedback is always appreciated. Have a good night.